I think we can start. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel, Intimacy by Design, Governing Human-AI Relationships. It's cool to see that so many people are interested in our topic. My name is Lisa. I'm a researcher and PhD student at the University Duisburg-Essen in Germany. My background is in cognitive science and psychology, and I investigate how people form relationships with general purpose systems like ChatGPT and what drives these processes. And basically, I'm looking from both the user side and the system side into it, and into how and why people disclose to systems like that very personal information. And the panel and my work, and also the work of two of our panelists, is part of the project Sentiment, which is an interdisciplinary research project funded by the German Federal Ministry for Research, Technology and Space. And we're exploring basically intimate communication with text-generative AI from the perspectives of psychology, law, computer science, and the arts. And we also have an exhibition space in the second floor, right? Yeah, where you can see some of the artistic, first floor, sorry, artistic works incorporating our research. Yeah, and we have 4 panelists today. I think I can use this. Yeah. I'm going to introduce them to you shortly. So first we have Mieke. She's an adjunct professor at the Belric, is that right? Business school here in Belgium, and she has a background in civil and industrial engineering and is specialized in robotics and AI. She's also working as a business consultant and consults on risk and values of AI systems, has written several books on his topics, and the newest one is called The Chatbot Trap, which just has been published. Secondly, we have Jessica. She is head of the junior research group Intitech, short for Intimacy with and Through Technology, at the University Duisburg-Essen and the RC Trust. And for over a decade, she has been conducting empirical research on intimacy, digitalized intimacy, human-AI interaction, and effective technologies. And she's the principal investigator of the project Sentiment. Then we have Christian. He's working at the Research Center for Information System Design at the University Kassel as a lawyer, and his work focuses on fundamental rights-based technology design and digitalization, and he's responsible for the law side of the project Sentiment. And lastly, we have Megan. She's a PhD researcher of the ERC-funded Data Union project. She has a background in archival and information management and is currently researching databases, incorporability impact on e-evidence systems, accountability mechanisms, and justice frameworks. And here's how the panel is gonna work. I'm gonna do a short introduction on the topic because I think some of you might not be that familiar with the empirical side of it. And then we have statements from each panelist on the topic from the viewpoint of their expertise. Then we have the discussion on the panel, and we have some time for your questions to the panelists and a discussion in the room. Yeah, so when we're talking about intimacy with technology, we can look onto that topic from different viewpoints. It spans over from romantic relationships with systems like Replica onto intimate conversations with systems like ChatGPT. There has been a lot of media coverage in the last 2 years, I would say. Some of the cases which were really prominent in the media were like the suicide cases in combination with character AI, where the interaction, intimate interaction, private interaction with chatbots really came into the public viewpoint. We know from data we have already that this is not a niche anymore, so we don't have really demographic data on the people interacting with these systems, but we have some data on how people are feeling about these systems. So we have one study that says that about 16 to 18% of American individuals reported having engaged with AI as a romantic companion. And we have studies saying that 45% said that AI partners made them feel more understood than their human partner. And we have a study saying that 36% that AI offered stronger emotional support than their human partner. As from a psychological perspective and as a basis, we know that love, sex, intimacy, all these things are fundamental human experiences based on a fundamental need to belong. So these things are needs that mostly all humans have in a way or another, but not all humans are able to have that fulfilled in ways with other humans or don't want to have it fulfilled with other humans. So we have people who turn to technology for these kinds of needs. As I said in the introduction, it's important to distinguish between two different types of technologies in this work. We have on the one side the AI companions, for example, Replica or Character AI or Nomi AI. We also have a lot of different smaller ones, but these are the most prominent ones. And on the other hand, we have general purpose AI systems or chatbots like ChatGPT, Claude. But ChatGPT is here in that sense also the most prominent one. Intimacy by design is a theoretical concept we introduced in our work, which we describe as the deliberate implementation of emotional responsiveness, romantic resonance, and sexual suggestiveness into technological systems through social agents. And this is reinforced by mechanisms like the interface aesthetics of the systems, narrative constructions that are implemented into the conversations, adaptive feedback loops, and also personalization possibilities. We've written a paper on this. You have the QR code in the bottom. It's a preprint, but it's going to be published soon, so you can read it shortly. And with all these things, there come some risks we want to talk about today in the panel. We have, on one hand, the problems of manipulation or disinformation that people are very prone to when they're interacting with those kind of systems, and data protection and privacy, of course, because people are sharing really intimate data with the systems when they are actively engaging in emotionally resonant conversations. And also we have risks of nudging harmful behavior by the companions and emotional dependence that could occur when we're interacting with the systems also for a longer time. Yes. And as we also want to speak about the regulatory side of this phenomenon, we have the EU AI Act, which has not really covered AI companions or also general purpose systems for those kind of usages. So the only thing we have in the AI Act is that it requires mandatory labeling of bots on non-human dialogue systems, so transparency, bot disclosure, but there's no guidance in the AI Act on how to realize such safeguards, when to place them, how that should look like, and so on. And that's something we want to discuss also some further in the panel. Yeah, and then with that, we come to the statements of the panelists. And Mika, you can start.
Excellent. So the first question is to introduce ourselves. It's probably the easiest one. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me. Also, it's also great to see you so massively presented here for an important topic. My name is Mieke de Ketel. I am an engineer by education, studied indeed AI 35 years ago. For a very long time, I was very fond of my technology. I really saw the positive sides until everything changed for me in January 2023. That was the date that the very first suicide case, which was a Belgian case, became available. I was in touch directly with the family, and for me, it was an unseen world. It was something I'd never seen in my AI world, that chats could have been created, that people would have gone so far to follow the conversations of the chats. I decided back then to really go undercover. I've been undercover for 3 years now. What I mean with this is I actually mingle myself in the development teams to understand what the techniques are that they're developing. I mingle myself in user teams. They're mainly found back on Reddit and other forums. And I mingle myself in the creatives, which you can find back in Discord servers, etc., understanding what direction they're taking. And when you put this all together, you actually come up with very toxic results. And I think we've seen this all happening. When I jump now ahead, the statistics show 360 cases of suicide and AI psychosis, which are the strongest cases. However, what I found out is that the biggest and probably the most impact long-term will be the emotional reliance cases. These are cases where people just completely are addicted to their technology. In my opinion, but we'll talk about it, that's the strongest one that we don't get enough attention in media. If you're interested in my work, so indeed I wrote this book, the Chatbot Trap, in which I show all the efforts I've done, talking to compliancy teams, to product safety teams at European level, GDPR teams, Max Schrems teams, to unlock the file with the AI Act. I used the form, the whistleblowing form, just to realize that from all 6 doors I have available in Europe to knock on, that none of them work today. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Jessica Stucker. I have a background in computer science and psychology, and since more than 10 years, I'm basically studying how digitalization affects the concepts of love and sexuality. I try to do it empirically because one of my goals is to actually inform evidence-based regulations, which becomes more and more important. I'm so happy to see so many people here because for so long, the topic has been understood as like lovey-dovey, that's like entertainment and so on. But especially talking about privacy, now the community finally gets to understand that there is high sensitive data that is spread and that we need to take this problem serious, especially as we see how many people are using that. So my statement basically tackles 4 different perspectives. First one being, as a psychologist and seeing all the data that we gather, is that not every relationship human have to chatbot is harmful. It is the right and the autonomy of the people to actually go into those relationships if they are informed. We see multiple cases of our participants who actually strongly benefit because at the first time in a long time, they have an access to actually live out those fundamental human needs. However, at the same time, we see what I and my co-authors labeled intimacy by design, meaning that those technologies are designed to basically create vulnerability. And vulnerability for the longest time has been understood as a classification, meaning certain age or a certain group of people. However, this is now not a byproduct, but actually the product of what results from the product. So therefore, this technology needs to be regulated in a specific way to understand every user of it is vulnerable in some form. We are all vulnerable in intimate relationships. So therefore, this needs to be understood from a regulatory side. And this brings me to transparency and the current regulations. EU AI Act tackles a lot about transparency, also to cover the risks of privacy and data collection, but nobody really knows whether those transparency and bot disclosure laws will actually prevent any harm from the people. And this then brings me to the last point, risk evaluation. At the moment, this is totally in the hands of the companies running those systems. And I think this is a huge mistake. We don't know, actually for us scientists, we now like the big players, they come up with those reports. We don't understand them. We don't know what kind of psychologists are included. We don't know what kind of risks they actually research, how they research it. And it's very, very important to get more transparency also on the risk evaluations that are going on. So this is basically a little bit of my perspective that I gathered through the last years working on that topic. Thank you.
I'm Christian Gemin from the University of Kassel, and I'm here to give a brief introduction to the legal side of things. And just to restate what Lisa has already said, I will not talk about the general legal issues of any type of AI chatbot. I will talk specifically about AI companions. There are, of course, a lot of legal issues in multiple areas, data protection law, copyright law, criminal law, and so on. But at least for the moment, I would like to focus on the AI Act. AI companions are not prohibited under Article 5 of the AI Act. The reason, or one of the main reasons, is that it will in practice be quite difficult to prove that there is causality between the system's influence and harm that might result on the user side. The AI Act prohibits certain subliminal techniques, purposefully manipulative or deceptive techniques, as well as the exploitation of certain vulnerabilities, but that is rather vague wording. Emotional dependence is probably not encompassed. But then again, lawmakers didn't have AI companions in mind when drafting the AI Act. As a result, they also do not fall into the category of high-risk AI systems, which means that the core provisions of the AI Act do not apply. They do, however, need to adhere to the transparency requirements that falls in Article 50, which Lisa has already mentioned. The Commission has recently published their draft guidelines for Article 50, and they actually use the term AI companion 3 times. That's not an excessive amount, but it shows that there is a certain amount of awareness which wasn't there until recently, at least as far as I'm aware. Interestingly, they also talk about AI-powered robotic companion pets, robots that look highly similar to their natural equivalents and which are designed to mimic typical human-pet interaction. But maybe that's also something that we could get into during our discussion. The Commission confirms that AI companions fall indeed under Article 50 of the AI Act, meaning that they must be, and I quote from Article 50, designed and developed in such a way that the natural persons concerned are informed that they are interacting with an AI system, unless this is obvious from the point of view of a natural person who is reasonably well informed, observant, and circumspect, taking into account the circumstances and the context of use. Now, the draft guidelines, and you can see that on the slide here, they also state, in particular, one-time disclosures at the beginning of an interaction may not be considered adequate in the context of sustained or evolving interactions, especially in sensitive contexts, for example, where users may express or experience emotional distress or vulnerability, and where there is an increased risk of users being misled or forming emotional attachment, for example, AI companions, one of these three points in the guidelines where they use the term. This means now that periodic reminders are needed and that the context must be taken into account, and that is also a requirement found in recent legislation in the state of New York, which, by the way, goes far beyond the legal requirements in the EU in many aspects. There seems to be a consensus that AI companions cannot and should not fall under the exception for obviousness. Now, I would like to put two things up for discussion. First, how can the required level of transparency be achieved for AI companions? And what even is the required level of transparency precisely in this context? And second, should AI companions be considered high-risk AI systems, or should there be, either alternatively or additionally, specific obligations like for suicide prevention, that is a requirement already established by the New York law, by the way, which, as I said, goes way beyond the current legal framework here in the EU. Yeah, that's it for now from the legal side.
Perfect, thank you. My name is Megan. I'm a doctoral researcher at LSDS at VUB. And so my contribution comes from the perspective of critical archival and information studies, which interrogates record-keeping practices through critical theory in order to question knowledge and power, how and why it circulates, and through whose hands. I want to ask a slightly different question. What kind of record is being created and what persists when a person forms a relationship with an AI system? Behind the interface, the relationship does not produce only a chat transcript, it produces metadata, inferred traits, and derived data that organize how the relationship continues. The evidentiary and privacy risk may sit as much in the metadata or paradata as in the words exchanged. If we only ask whether chat content is stored, we miss the deeper question: what metadata and derived traces organize the relationship? Those records may also be scattered across a wider technical and legal infrastructure, and once they cross jurisdictions, data protection becomes more of a custody and control question. So who holds the record, which law applies, and who can compel access and who can delete it? This has direct consequences for consent. Users are often asked to agree before the sensitivity of the relationship has emerged and before they understand what kind of record they are creating. Consent at sign-up cannot account for what the records become over time, nor for how long any part of them persists. This also adds to how we think about disclosure. What disclosure can assume to some extent an informed and rational individual who can identify and manage risk. But a user can know they are speaking to an AI and still not understand what the relationship becomes as data. So what the system does with the relationship during the conversation and after it ends. Disclosure should not only answer, am I speaking to a bot? It should also answer what records are being produced, how they change over time, and who can access and use them. This leads to provenance, which is not only about origin, it's about the context of creation. A chat log may appear to be a record of what the user said and felt, but it is equally a record of what the system was designed to elicit. Its authenticity is therefore not only a question of whether the timestamp is accurate, but whether enough context is preserved to understand how the interaction was produced. If these logs later become evidence, we need to ask not only what the user said, but what the system was configured to elicit, remember, or suppress. On developer and platform responsibility, I would suggest that documentation focus less on generic transparency statements and more on the data lifecycle of the relationship with proportionate documentation, enough to make platform responsibility auditable, but not so much that intimate life is permanently converted into institutional memory and evidence. Ultimately, we need to study not only what the chatbot says or how users feel, but what kind of record the relationship creates, who controls it, what metadata organizes it, what frameworks apply, and when it should be allowed to disappear. That means empirics not only on user attachment or self-disclosure, but on the data and record infrastructures that make these relationships persistent, actionable, and auditable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your statements. We have in total 4 questions guiding the panel, but as we're so many people here in the room, I want to ask beforehand how many of you have now immediate questions you want to ask, or when there are none, we would go on with the discussion on the panel and then come back later to questions in the audience. So is there anyone having a question right now?
Hi, I'm Fatima from Leiden University. I wanted to ask a question from psychological perspective. How do you analyze the relationship between companion chatbots and people from attachment theory?
You mean attachment theory in terms of how the individual predispositions affect the question of whether people would then...
Yeah, if it might, how much it's complied with that theory, and how much guidelines that are based from the parliament help and somehow helping people to just get along with the issues that come from the attachment theory and the backgrounds that they, psychological backgrounds that they have.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There is research specifically on the impact of attachment theory. However, I would say that's not the only variable that circulates in the whole question of who's more prone into using those systems, because one of the most obvious variables is, of course, loneliness. We have a loneliness epidemic, so there is the social cure, there are social chatbots, and everybody will use it. So there is, to my knowledge, only a few papers that would say, for instance, avoidant attachers are more prone into those safe outlets. But again, for instance, our data, we see that loneliness might not even play such a big role, especially in those long-term romantic relationship people have with their chatbots, because we have quantitative data actually that shows what kind of, or the first glimpses, empirical glimpses into who uses them and what kind of personality traits play a role. And actually there, the ability to fantasize is a big factor, because it actually helps the users to create a world that is bigger than what they see on their screens. So therefore, this technology might not be something for all in terms of like actually saying this is my romantic partner, because there are those people now, but still there are enough people that we should care about it in terms of effective regulation. I hope this helps a little bit, but we can talk later on in terms of if you are specifically interested in attachment theory and links to that, yeah.
Okay, any other questions right now? Okay, then we can go into the topic of regulation at first. We've already dived into that topic in the statements. So our first guiding question is, does intimacy by design constitute a new category of risk that requires regulatory treatment beyond current data protection and AI governance approaches? Maybe Christian, you can start from the law perspective. I mean, you already started talking about this.
Well, the short answer, I would say, is yes, because the current legal framework is simply insufficient to address these very, very high risks addressed with the use of these AI companions. It's simply not geared towards that. It's geared to what you could frame as ordinary data protection or these general purpose AI systems. And I think there is a gap that it should be addressed. The issue is, how should we address it? I mean, I already hinted at that we could simply label it as high-risk AI systems. Then the core provisions of the AI Act would apply, so that might help, but it might not be sufficient. And I think the fact that we've seen the state of New York and other states in the US pass legislation specifically aimed at AI companions, well, it says a lot. And I think it's something that we should also think about in the EU.
Maybe just to add on that, because we already had that, with that being discussed, then also comes the question of this artificial classification of general purpose models on AI and AI companions, because it's easy to say basically this just applies, or high risk then only applies for AI companions. But for instance, data of Lisa in her PhD shows that people, that the chatbots basically tell stories about how their relation to their parents is. A chatbot's saying that, or the chatbot's telling them how they love to travel and so on. So, and that's general purpose models. So this classification is very artificial. So if we would talk about a new category of risk, this would need to apply for both general purpose models as well as AI companions. Because for now, especially in the US, the AI companions are the bad guys, and the general purpose models have an easy fix of not being tailored with those laws. So therefore, yeah.
Mike, you talked in your statement about your glimpses into the real world consequences, or talking with also the developers of the system. Do you see, or how do the developers themselves understand the risks of these emotional designs, and are they aware of what they're building into the systems? And is intimacy often a theme emerging in your research?
It's a very good question. First of all, I would like to add something about the two categories in my book, but that might, we can discuss this. There's one additional category. So you've got the big language models, you've got the chatbots that are just and purely made for this, but you have this middle class, for example, the AI bot that automatically switches on in Snapchat. Children, they have their friends, and the bot automatically installs itself. So it's not one, it's not the other, so but it's there. And you almost need a doctor degree to take it away. It just represents itself. So I just want to make that side note. But about the engineers, look, the engineers, and I'm just going to put my own hat on, we don't automatically think about the impact of our technology on humans, especially not on the long-term risks or the long-term impact. And we've talked a lot about the privacy, the data privacy, but there's another set of risks that I don't see tackled. And I'm just going to try to explain this. What we've seen in the last 3 years is an enormous effort from technical techniques to strengthen that relationship. Going from the 3 little dots that you might have on WhatsApp, they also appear in your chatbot. From a technical point of view, you don't need these 3 dots to say that the chatbot is answering. The answer is ready, but just to simulate that behavior. However, what I see is that there's a lot of effort in creating the relationship. There is no effort once the relationship is stopped. When at a certain point in time with Pierre, the first case, they decided to take the two apps, that was Chai and Character.ai, to take them offline from the app stores, Apple and Google. The amount of people that went to hospital because they had suicidal thoughts was much higher than when the apps were online. Because why? Because their relationship had already started. So just taking them offline is not an option. The train left the station. But what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, what we've seen now, and we've seen it very clearly in the numbers, is that the amount of people that find their way to chatbots is increasing. The other side, there are no techniques available to decrease a relationship. But all of those names that you've seen, they're going IPO later this year. This means that they're going to market, and they will be running out of money. I tell you now on a plate, if it's OpenAI, if it's anyone out of there, there will be some of them that will no longer be available. But there's nothing available, nothing programmed, nothing, no companies, no hospitals ready for taking in the people or the patients or the victims that will have suddenly a loved one no longer available to them. And for me, that's a big risk that nobody talks about.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to comment on that, any one of you?
I think the whole idea of rethinking vulnerability is super important, because compare your relationships with your friends, your partners, intimate partners, and so on. You are vulnerable in those situations that you are interacting with them, right? So therefore, this also applies to those chatbots and the relationships that are formed there. And so far, the vulnerability classes that we have, especially in law, is too much focused on different classes of people, basically. You have to have a certain classification to belong to a class of vulnerable person. And with that, the product is vulnerability. And therefore, I think this very much is what I would love to highlight here.
Yeah, thank you. We already started talking about responsibility. We have a second question. So what responsibilities do developers, platform providers have when AI systems facilitate or enable harmful or illegal interaction scenarios? And Megan, maybe you can speak on that from a perspective of accountability mechanisms. So we have here cross-border digital systems. How do we enforce responsibility when platforms inherently are multi-jurisdictional with developers in one country, servers in another, and users kind of everywhere?
Yeah, I think to start off, I think the developers and the platforms need to, in advance, think about the future issues, of course. Perhaps some more ethics training would help there. But otherwise, cross-border enforcement obviously needs cooperation and communication between the regulators, but also really shared documentation standards. There also really needs to be an emphasis on the ability of handing over raw data instead of potentially not a complete record from the start, which has had some precedent in other cases, not connected to this. But in general, I think it's more education and raw data, and also packaging, being able to explain that raw data to the user, to be honest, to everyone, it should be understandable.
Yeah. Maybe in general, I think it's also a part of the wording, because we came across that in our research as well. When I gave a talk about, we called it privacy by design meets intimacy by design, and privacy by design means two different things when you talk to computer scientists and lawyers. So the computer scientists told me it's the wrong kind of wording, because it would be privacy enhancing technologies, as we're talking about technologies that already exist. So we want to implement safeguards into the existing systems. But then Christian told me that privacy by design mechanisms from a law perspective mean something different. Maybe you can comment on that, what we understand or your expertise understands in privacy by design mechanisms, as we already talked about the bot disclosure part, and maybe we can dive into that a bit.
Well, first of all, this the issue that privacy by design is a concept, Canadian concept, and it's sometimes equated with data protection by design, which we actually mean when we talk about privacy by design in the European legal context. But when it comes to data protection by design, a lot of the risks that emanate from these AI companions are simply not addressed because a lot can be circumvented if user consent is present. So I mean, it's not a fix-all to have to use the wording privacy by design or data protection by design. There needs to be something on top, and this concept of intimacy by design addresses a lot of these issues, maybe not all of them, because the aspect of dependency and the issues resulting from that might still need another layer on top of that to really mitigate the risks associated with these chatbots.
Okay, can I add something to this? Well, just to make it fact-based, if you take Chai, our character.ai, what we should not forget is that there's a tiny company, because they're startups, right? There's a tiny company that have the servers, that have the model, that define the techniques. But the bots, when you go on these apps, and I really would invite everybody to go on these apps, you've got a library full of chatbots, inspired by Einstein to Miss Peggy from Sesame Street, whatever you want, you'll find them, to the housewife, to your sports master, whatever. But these communities, and I invite you really to involve yourself in these communities, they have nothing to do, they're not paid by the startup. They just use their fantasies that they have over the world, and it goes from the manosphere to the hatred towards, homosexual people, etc. When things go off rail, what you have, and I've been in these discussions, we opened up a GDPR case, is the fact that those developers or those creatives say, well, it isn't our platform, it's not us. Whereas the platform vendors say, well, it's not our bot, it's not us. And so what you see is like dislocated responsibilities where everybody points to everybody and there's nothing to say. However, nobody's observing the user. And the second point that I would like to say is from my undercover work, there are control rooms at all levels, so they don't observe the user by the, it's not Mieke they observe, but they observe user 1, 2, 3, 4, so in an anonymous way. So they know very well at what point in time that people get too much addicted or when people get extremely vulnerable, but they don't do anything. And the only thing, for example, OpenAI did is in the chats with, in this case, Geraldine, was to inform her that her rights, her human rights were tackled. And she was advised by ChatGPT to get in touch with Europe. And the reason when you then dive into this, then you have to follow a certain guy, he's called Steve Adler. He used to work at OpenAI. He basically said that's because they don't want to give the impression they're observing us. So they do the right thing just by informing the user, you have to contact Europe, you have to contact your local authorities, but they don't want to do it themselves or stop the conversation. You've got to be aware of this, so they do observe the conversations and there are ways technically just to stop at that point in time, but they just decide not to. So it's quite an important point.
I know that we are jumping a little bit between the topics, but I would still love to quickly address one important thing in terms of the transparency aspect, because we just talked about it from the EU AI law perspective and how this should solve so many problems. Maybe just to make that clear, from all the psychological empirical studies that we do where we have participants in those relationships, they are very much aware that they are talking to a chatbot. They don't need that information. That will not change a thing because they want the social stimulants without the fear of negative feedback. They have so many different motivations. If you're interested in that, feel free to reach out afterwards and we can talk hours about that. But there are so many different things they get out of that socially. So therefore, the sheer information that they're talking to an artificial entity will not stop them from continuing that. I love what you just said, Megan, in terms of the information cycle. what kind of data is gathered, how is it used. We have first papers, first analysis that shows that the data is sold to third parties and so on. But this is not something users are now probably informed. And I always say, if an adult user who is informed still wants to seek that kind of social validation and relationship, it should lie in their autonomy to actually pursue those relationships. But are they really informed? Is there a form of informed consent? How is that possible with those privacy regulations where sometimes I have the feeling not even the companies know what they do with those, with the information, with the data points. So therefore, I have the feeling that the idea that bot disclosure transparency should solve any form of problems might not be it. That's just what I needed to get off my chest in terms of discussing transparency.
Then again, with what you just said, would that matter? I mean, transparency about talking to a bot, that's one side. Transparency about data processing that happens in the background, that's another thing. But maybe that's also irrelevant to the users. They will still seek the benefits from the interaction. So all the information obligations from the GDPR, for example, that would not help even if they were adhered to the letter or to the highest standard, basically.
100%. I have one participant in mind that she told me basically I had to choose between, do I care about my privacy or do I want a social life? And she chose the social life or the social stimulants, basically. Yeah, but that should not be a question of either this or that. There should be a form of social usage if it helps a person without fearing that they have no control at all of what happens to their data. Yeah.
We have one question in the audience in the back.
I was just thinking about Article 7, paragraph 4 of GDPR. So Article 7 is about the conditions for consent. And paragraph 4 is about the sort of assessment of whether consent is freely given. And so I work for a trade union. I mainly work on data protection in the employment context. And the European Data Protection Board has issued non-binding guidance in that context that basically says a worker can never freely consent. Or it should be presumed by the Data Protection Authority that a consent given from the worker to their employer for processing of their personal data cannot be freely given. So basically they discourage employers from using consent as the legal basis. And I wonder if there's a similar maneuver that could be done here. Would that make a very big difference? Probably not, but obviously the problems are much more fundamental. I just thought I would ask that.
I would argue there should be a similar mechanism that targets emotional dependency that would lead users to give consent that is, well, not freely given. But I mean, it does raise practical issues. How do you register emotional dependency? With an employment contract, it's a binary situation, and you can easily check for that. But with these more complicated emotional states, it becomes rather hard. And that's why I think it's something that, well, it's hard to tackle from the legal side. I think the groundwork is there with Article 7, but you would have to look at each individual case to find out whether or not consent is freely given in this specific situation. And that then again might simply not be feasible. So that leads us to the argument that, well, maybe consent should not be available as a basis for processing in these specific situations, but that opens, of course, a whole other can of worms.
Maybe we can, as I think we have established that we're all agreed that the disclosure obligation is not enough. Maybe, Jesse, you can elaborate on what other mechanisms could work from an empirical side, or what's been tested, or what we're aiming to test as privacy mechanisms to actually influence behavioral changes in the users in terms of disclosure, sensitive information.
Yeah, but I guess you also wanted to jump in if I saw correctly, right?
Yeah, but it was just in addition to, because it's very good discussion. But if I'm allowing myself, and that's my personal view, we are looking to it in a much complex way, and these are very important discussions. But when we just go back to the facts, and the facts are that, for example, in a ChatGPT or in any of these tools that were mentioned, there's a button, you can export your data. When you export your data, you get a zip file. After 15 minutes, sometimes it takes a bit longer. In the zip file, you get 3 types of documents. You get all the pictures you've shared, you get your chats in a certain format, and you get a JSON file. Now, GDPR says that it should be in readable format. I argue that the JSON file is a readable format for general. You also clearly see that not all the pictures you've sent are in the file that you're getting back, so it's not complete. There's many things we just can fall back on the current, GDPR. When we talk, I've tried to open up a GDPR case for each of them. I have not succeeded in there. Just to highlight that the basic law, that the way that we've understood it all, just not even thinking about what is manipulation, what is addiction, etc., but just the basic facts. I'm sending you this data, you have to send it back to me, and I have to be able to understand it as a non-technical user, is not fulfilled. That's what we need to look at. That's there, that's on the table. And we shouldn't do this case by case by case. Just do an export of your data. You'll see it.
And maybe to reoccur on your question in terms of what can we do proactively also, or what kind of technologies or ideas do we have? There are multiple ones. Every input that, every word that is inserted can also be pre-analyzed before it is actually processed through the whole server in terms of, do you really want to proceed? There are multiple things that could be done in order to really ensure that people are aware of what is happening. Opting out, deleting data. There are so many easy fixes to, at least, I would say, urgent threats, but nothing of that is implemented. I mean, the sheer fact that people are always surprised if I tell them, hey, at least please log out of your data of ChatGPT or whatever is being used as training data. Please do that, like the least thing that you can do. And people are surprised because they would not know about that. And in terms of AI companions, many of them, they don't even have this opt-out feature, which is like the basic thing that we should have. Yeah, those are just super minimalist approaches of how it could be done better.
Yeah. As we have some questions, I guess, in the crowd, we can start maybe in the back there. Yeah. No. Yeah.
Hi. There we go. My name's Callie Schrader. I'm from the Electronic Privacy Information Center in the US, and we are doing a lot of state-by-state chatbot bills. And one of the proposals that we've looked at with some technologists is doing hard session limitations, time limitations, where you have to wipe after a certain amount, either of inputs and outputs or a time limitation. I'm wondering, in particular from the engineering and from the psychological side, are there legitimate arguments from companies that is not a possibility for whatever reason? Because they are certainly arguing that is not a technological possibility, and it is very hard to push back on that when they won't give us the internal information to prove that it is possible. And from a psychological perspective, is there damage to people if we are insisting that they can't maintain this ongoing relationship with the chatbot because the session is wiped and has to restart each time? Or is it possible that we're keeping the sessions short enough that we're avoiding the initial attachment and damage?
Would you? I'll take the engineering part, okay? Technically wise, your logical brain would say, this is a great idea. After 15 minutes, we stop the conversation and then you have to restart it. I'm afraid that's, although technically easy to realize, to be honest, it's us external people not being addicted to a chatbot that put the slider, When I think about the conversations that I followed, and things that I've read, it would be dangerous to do so, as an external people to say that. The reason why is that people turning to chatbots is because they aren't able to turn to people with their questions. The reasons you don't get to the fact that you're sitting here, not somewhere at home on your chatbot means something. So this means that doing this for them, I think it's how can I say this correctly? It's almost. I'm going to say this too hard when I use the word discrimination, but that's what I mean. Because you actually, it's like that there's a patient and you're going to deprive them from a certain type of help. So I find it dangerous because what I've seen is it does happen today when, for example, the service, I'm pointing to external countries where the servers are finding themselves without saying those countries. But if the servers go down or they're slowing down because there's too many people on there, I see literally in my user groups the stress of people. And today it is those who are paying their licenses, they get access to the servers and they get their answers. And those not paying, most of the time juniors, not being able to pay these licenses, they're deprived after 10 minutes to use their chatbots and they're completely stressed out. So I don't find it, although technically wise, easy to realize because it's already sort of happening by default because of the energy consumption of the servers. I see the stress happening in the user groups, and this is not healthy. So it would be too much of a shortcut to do, in my opinion, but that's the engineering side.
I have the feeling this was also very much actually a social side, but which is a good thing because you have so many insights on the cases. One thing, and this is a panel, so therefore we have different opinion. One thing where I'm a little bit hesitant is maybe the addiction term, because addiction is a clinical state. It needs a specific categorization to actually call something addictive, and I'm more hesitant about that. I see how people are always drawn to that, but social stimulants is a very rewarding system, which I think we should not easily put into one cup with addiction. But I know that there are different opinions on that, so that's maybe something my 2 cents on that. However, I have to basically agree. We are in a real world lab and this technology is already there. Taking it down, there are papers on that. Jamie Banks published a paper on that. Consequences of chatbot being put down and people basically suffering as if they would have a bad breakup, not eating for days, laying in bed in days, not communicating, stuff like that. They actually experience pain in some form. However, if people start knowing this restriction, then the story is a totally different one. That's what I mean with we are already in a real world lab where we are confronted with that technology and now we have to kind of in society work with that. So I actually wish that idea was already implemented in it, because if you know by first hand that the session is in some form limited, then this would change a lot. Yeah, 100%.
I'm just going to add one small thing, and because it's a very good addition. If you compare it, and I agree, we can have coffee over this. I shouldn't be using maybe the word addiction, but I'm using it because I don't have another word for seeing what I see. Yeah. But if you compare it, for example, in the time of COVID, all shops were closing down, inclusive alcohol shops. In the US, they left them open for 1 hour for both those people who were addicted. So, but it was a controlled way of closing everything down and just for a certain set of people opening it up. So if we have this, granularity to be able to open up certain chatbots for certain people, but this isn't available right now. So we just get ourselves inspired by what we did in the past. Yeah.
Okay, more questions. Yeah, here in the front.
Hi. I'm Emma. I'm currently studying at KU Leuven. I have 2 questions. The first is more from a legal perspective. So to the AI Act specifically, we've already seen through the AI Omnibus certain amendments, so to speak. Now, with the current issue of, for example, taking the suicides into consideration caused by these interactions, it's not something that has happened suddenly. There has been countless research for now years, in plural. So my question is there any insight as to why we haven't seen certain similar amendments, alterations, and whatnot to the AI Act to address this specific abuse of the systems? And my second question is, as we've rightly said, people have a right to these services. And on the other end, the companies also have a right to provide this emotional dependent platform. So given that people have a right to use it, and as you've said, you've encountered people who said they'd risk anything to use it, what safeguards can you truly envision that would prevent dependency, in the sense that if people have a right to it and companies have a right to provide it, and as you've seen, people are willing to risk whatever, how much can a company actually do to still provide the service that it has a right to provide, while also, if people are still willing to give anything, what can they really do?
Well, as to your first question, of course, I can't speak for the Commission why they do or do not do certain things, but I would speculate that the reason is simply a lack of awareness of the issue. It needs to be brought to their attention, and especially the numbers that we heard earlier of the percentage in usage of these systems, that might be very valuable to highlight the issues, and that might then trigger legislative action. But for now, I think it's simply a lack of awareness.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you talk to people externally, there's little people aware of it because people are ashamed of it. It's something we don't hear here today, but shame from using it. But parents, when they get somebody who gets becomes a victim, they are unaware. They say, we prepare our child for alcohol, we prepare our child for drugs, for aggression, but we don't prepare our children for companion chatbots, although they are the most vulnerable people on it. So it's also about the way that we talk about it. I mean, if you see the way we promote now alcohol, it's no longer the way we did it 30 years ago, and the way we promote cigarettes. It used to be a time where doctors were promoting cigarettes to be more socially acceptable. But how long do we need in order to see these type of campaigns? I don't understand.
And maybe I would love to add, from my perspective, there's not a singular ethical AI companion. And also, also think about the fact that there's no real big player from Europe with European values. I'm missing that because at the moment, we have a major general purpose model which basically promotes creating deepfakes. How can we have those values and then talk about how to make safe relationships with their users if we have that kind of, I would say, ideas in the head of the people that control those technologies? So therefore, I have the feeling the answer to how can we, if people have a right to it, what can companies do to make it safe? Starting from talking about this from an ethical point of view with data minimalization principles and so on would be a great start.
We had several questions in the back. I guess they are referring to this question, right? Yeah.
Wojciech Wiewiórowski, I'm the European Data Protection Supervisor. So the Data Protection Authority, not the Commission. But I guess the problem is not the lack of awareness, because the awareness definitely exists on the side of the Commission, but the lack of the answers what to do. And that's what we are discussing here. That's why I guess the Commission is also represented here. The lack of answers to the questions that you said and that we are aware of.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, and I agree, and I'm afraid we're part of a bad game, because by the time we provide insights, they've already changed the other side of the world. They've already changed the game of the rules of the game. Sorry. For example, on the last chatbot issues we had with ChatGPT, by the time we came out with it in February, they decided to close down those versions. That's the world we're in. So you can no longer prove it, you can no longer show it, you can no longer explain it. So the race is going on, and we just not part of it.
which also addresses risk evaluations. We see risk evaluations of certain models, and then there comes an update, but nothing talks about this new risk evaluation that would now need to be done.
Yeah, maybe Megan, that's part of your expertise because we talked about this earlier. It's maybe then a question of transparency and documentation ongoing, so that there isn't the possibility that something like this can be erased when a new model is introduced, so that we have an ongoing risk and or documentation and what the companies are doing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think one, perhaps the issue perhaps will be trade secrets in terms of updates. I mean, for internal documentation. However, otherwise, I think it should be pretty educationally viable to train either, I don't know, general organizations or also educators from a very kind of early standpoint to understand how things change, to how it's not just a video game that you purchase that has a specific kind of rule set and kind of transition period and end. It's an ongoing thing that can actually end up changing in a bad way for personal use.
Can I ask a question to the audience? Sure. Because we have very important people here. Isn't it possible to create an audit or like a reclassification? Because these tools are classified as entertainment. I think they're not, they're more than just entertainment. But if you look at the car, you do audits on cars before they come on the market. Here, we put systems on the market and then we have to run, behind it to show the issues. Isn't it possible, it might be just a question for myself, isn't it possible to do an audit upfront before somebody can play itself on the market and as an app?
That's what the AI Act is for, and that's why it was there was a delay in the implementation of that, because from the moment when the Act is fully enforced and you have to be fully compliant with it, the possibility of such an audit will exist.
Upfront, yeah.
Of course, if we put it into the high risk group.
Yeah, but in high risk, there is the fact that you cannot manipulate. But how are you going to prove manipulation? Somebody can be manipulated today, but not tomorrow because he feels much better. It's a very difficult one, technically wise, to show that somebody was manipulated by the bot. Because these are the discussions we are having,
But however, in psychological research, we can already show that behavior is affected and basically evaluations. So both aspects, cognitive and behavioral, can be affected in a certain way. There are first studies showing that.
Yeah, but what I see in the law cases in the US is that's where it fails. Is the families are unable to prove that there was manipulation because the kid was already unstable before starting to use it. And then you come in these debates, and so it's not an easy one, even if it's classified as high risk, which I absolutely adore, by the way.
And if I may add something, another layer is the issue of the damage that occurs in some cases where it results in death. Of course, it's easy to demonstrate that damage has occurred, but in many cases it will be very hard. We have to still define where the threshold lies between damage and, well, not legally significant damage.
Exactly, emotional reliance, where is this a damage?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Very, very good question.
Yeah, and I also think the wording manipulation is as a big word as addiction is. So it's, but we had a question here on the wall.
Hi, my name is Mohsen, and I study how AI agents are designed and why they behave the way they do. And I'm super happy that you guys already got in that tension, because that was going to be my start of my question, because I feel like there is all of these gaps that you guys are pointing out. And I'm here because I want to know what to do with those gaps. But something that is missing from me in this conversation is that we say intimacy by design, and then design involves agents themselves. And we are talking about how humans behave and what we adopt and what happens to us through the interactions with the agents. But there's also this entire emerging field of how agents are designed and how they behave in multi-agent systems. And in there's components that we could work with, I think. For instance, the memory of an agent, which you talked about, the data that they keep and how they manipulate that data. But there's also something super important that I have been interested about for 2 years. It's the scripts you give these agents, meaning how they are told how to behave. Anthropic has a document that is 10,000 words long. It's called the Constitution. And it really, it's an evolutionary document that tells Claude how to interact with human beings. And I feel like a lot of these conversations, for me, what's missing is like, we're talking about a latent space where we analyze what happens after effect, and the companies are like 10,000 steps ahead of us, figuring out how to design the memory, how to design the scripts. So how do we bring all of you guys and the expertise you have in that space where the agents are designed? That is maybe my question.
It's a very good question, but because you point something out which wasn't mentioned before. You've got the AI, that's just a system based on advanced statistics, let's be honest, and it's data-driven. Then you've got, the script, the prompt, the basic prompt that every vendor defines for itself how to have the system act. And indeed, Anthropic, there's no single suicide case with Anthropic because it acts much stricter than other vendors. But then something that is unclear enough, which I would like to talk to you about afterwards, is next to these two layers, so the AI, the script, and the guardrails, just to make it sure that it fits our world, then there is an additional script that's been programmed, where, for example, certain companies work together with MIT to classify the user, and based on this classification, they're just going to do certain tests. So in the JSON file, you literally see test failed, test success, etc. This is no longer AI. This is no longer agentic AI. This is purely testing on humanity. And this is something we should be able to limit, and that's what I don't hear enough in the discussions. We're still trying to figure out how this AI works and how the guardrails work. But for me, the strongest mistake that is made is the pure testing that's done on humanity. Where you literally see that things are filtered out, things are being sold, this is not acceptable, point.
And I actually also am super happy that you bring up basically the concept of system prompts versus user prompts, because if we would regulate and then again distinguish between AI companion and general purpose model, there has to be a way to actually talk about how systems are told to behave. And these are basically the rules. And obviously, even though there are tragic cases of suicide in very harmful ways, but especially when you look at the media coverage and the numbers of users, the numbers seem to go down a bit because, and every case is a case that should not be there. But it is because companies invest a lot in content moderation and telling the system how to behave on a certain topic, which is theoretically great. But why do they do it exactly in that form and they don't do it with other topics? It's obviously because there is a systematic I would say, incentive to regulate certain topics that are more highly debated within media and others are less debated. We have not even touched upon the fact that chatbots in a very large scale are also used to create abuse scenarios and so on, and are still allowed even though we know about this, and still the technology is able to produce that. So I totally agree. If there should be a regulation for general purpose AI, system prompts need to be included as how not only to have it as a black box, but actually specifically say what is a user and what is also the responsibility of the system.
We have 2 minutes left in the panel, so but we're still here for the day and also tomorrow.
Yes,
so
please.
Feel free to reach out afterwards. So maybe we have a closing question in the back.
Unhealthy dependency or reinforcing harmful fantasies and compulsive behavior? Can meaningful safeguards against unhealthy dependency exist? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's basically touching upon what we just mentioned, the question of how a system is told to basically behave. Because let's put it into realistic words. Engagement is their form of making money.
Right.
Keeping users there, creating extreme outputs, creating also emotionally important outputs is something that they make money with. So therefore, why is that? But then, is that something that is really helpful and necessary? Then we talk again about ethics and designing systems that are in line with our values. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I guess we're on point with the timings. Thank you so much for the panelists. Thank you, everyone. Yes, here are all the LinkedIn profiles. And as I said, all the panelists, I guess, are at least here today. So feel free to reach out.